In late February of 1838, Dieter Vogel opened a wooden box in his Wyoming cabin and removed a venison roast that looked as if it had been butchered that morning. Outside, his nearest neighbor was boiling leather scraps for soup because every piece of meat in his cache had turned to gray, freezer-burned mush. What Dieter had built that fall, a simple wooden chest filled with salt, would seem like madness to every trapper who saw it, until the winter proved them all wrong. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1836 was not the coldest Dieter Vogel had endured in the Wyoming wilderness, but it was the one that killed his partner. Ernst Kohler died on February 23rd, not from a grisly attack or a fall through ice, or any of the dramatic ends that claimed most mountain men. He died because the meat they had preserved for winter had failed them. Dieter and Ernst had done everything right according to conventional wisdom. They had killed 2 elk and 3 deer in November, processing the meat, using methods every experienced trapper knew. They had smoked strips of venison over greenwood fires for days until the meat turned dark and leathery. They had rubbed salt into larger cuts, though sparingly because salt cost more than gunpowder on the frontier. They had hung portions outside where the cold would keep them frozen solid. They had even buried some wrapped meat in a snowbank, an old technique some trappers swore by. By late February, they should have had adequate supplies to last until spring hunting. Instead, they were starving. The smoking had not been thorough enough. When Dieter cut into what should have been preserved venison, he found the interior had begun to rot despite the dried exterior. The frozen meat had suffered through temperature swings. Days when February's sun warmed the air above freezing, followed by nights of brutal cold. The repeated thawing and refreezing had turned the meat into something gray and crystalline, the texture closer to wet wood than food. The buried cache had flooded during a brief thaw, and what they retrieved was inedible. Ernst made the decision that killed him. On February 20th, he cut away the obviously rotten portions of their remaining smoked meat and cooked what looked marginally acceptable. Dieter argued against it, but Ernst was desperate and hungry and insisted the cooking would kill anything harmful. He ate a full meal of the questionable venison. Within 12 hours, Ernst was violently ill. Dieter recognized food poisoning, but had no remedy beyond keeping his partner warm and offering water. For 3 days, Ernst suffered with convulsions and fever. His body rejected everything, even water. Dieter could only watch as his partner weakened. On the morning of the 23rd, Ernst Kohler died in the small cabin they had shared for 2 trapping seasons. Dieter buried Ernst on a hillside above their camp, piling stones over the grave to prevent animals from disturbing it. He stood there for a long time in the February cold, looking at the makeshift cairn, thinking about what had actually killed his friend. It was not bad luck. It was not an act of God. It was a solvable problem that neither of them had known how to solve. They had killed enough game. They had worked hard to preserve it. But their methods had failed at the one thing that mattered, keeping meat edible for the length of a mountain winter. That night, alone in the cabin, Dieter made a decision that would consume him for the next year. He would solve this problem. He would figure out how to keep meat genuinely fresh, not merely edible for a few weeks, but truly preserved for months. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would never watch another man die because preservation methods failed. Spring came to the Wyoming Territory in late March of 1837, and Dieter Vogel began his education in failure. He spent that entire season visiting other trappers' camps, not to socialize, but to examine how men preserved meat and where their methods broke down. His first stop was a camp 15 miles north, where 3 French-Canadian trappers worked the beaver streams. They used smoking exclusively, hanging strips of venison and elk in a dedicated smokehouse they had built from green willow. Dieter inspected their setup carefully, noting how they maintained low, steady fires using cottonwood and alder. The meat looked properly preserved, dark and dry. But when he asked about losses, the oldest trapper admitted they typically lost a quarter of their stores to mold or interior rot that the smoking had not penetrated. 2 weeks later, Dieter found a solitary trapper named Wilhelm Beck, who relied on freezing. Beck had dug a pit on the north side of a hill where snow lingered and temperatures stayed consistently cold. He stored wrapped meat there, covered with pine branches and snow. It seemed efficient until Beck showed Dieter the reality. Every piece of meat from the previous winter had severe freezer burn, the surfaces oxidized to gray-brown, the texture grainy and unpleasant. Beck ate it because he had to, not because it was good. By May, Dieter had cataloged a dozen different preservation approaches. Some trappers used heavy salting, rubbing coarse salt into every surface and rewrapping the meat in canvas. This worked better than smoking, but required constant monitoring and regular resalting. One man had tried packing meat in rendered bear fat, creating a sealed environment. It had worked moderately well until warm weather caused the fat to go rancid, ruining everything. Another trapper had experimented with underground storage in a spring house built over a cold creek. Animals had broken in and destroyed his entire cache in one night. The pattern Dieter identified was consistent and depressing. Every method had a catastrophic failure point. Smoking failed when not thorough enough. Freezing failed during temperature fluctuations. Light salting failed over time. Fat sealing failed in warmth. Underground storage failed against determined animals. No conventional technique could guarantee that meat would remain genuinely fresh for 4 or 5 months. Dieter began asking older trappers about the longest they had successfully kept meat. Most said 2 months at best before quality degraded significantly. A few claimed 3 months using combination methods, smoking, then freezing, or salting, then smoking. But no one could describe a technique that kept meat in truly fresh condition from November through March. By early June, Dieter had traveled over 200 miles visiting camps and talking to anyone who would share their methods. He filled a small journal with notes, sketches of smokehouses and storage pits, recipes for salt rubs and fat renderings. But more importantly, he had identified the core problem. Conventional preservation methods slowed decay but could not stop it. What he needed was not a better version of existing techniques. He needed something that created an environment where decay could not happen at all. The answer came to Dieter in early July while he was skinning a beaver near a creek that reminded him of Pennsylvania. The landscape was wrong. Wyoming was all sagebrush and pine where Pennsylvania had been hardwood forest. But something about the way morning light hit the water triggered a memory he had not thought about in 20 years. He was 8 years old again, standing at the entrance to his father's workplace. The Schiller salt mine outside Pittsburgh, where his father worked 6 days a week extracting rock salt from deposits laid down by ancient seas. Dieter had visited the mine only twice, but the experience had marked him in ways he had not understood until this moment beside a Wyoming creek. He remembered descending into the earth on wooden stairs, the temperature dropping with each step until the air felt cool, even in summer. He remembered the chamber opening up, vast and white, walls of crystalline salt stretching into darkness beyond the lamplight. He remembered his father explaining how nothing rotted in the mine. No wooden timbers decayed despite decades underground. No leather harnesses fell apart. No food spoiled if left there. The salt drew moisture from everything, created an environment where the processes of decay simply stopped. But the memory that mattered most came from his grandmother's kitchen. She had been German, old country, and she had preserved meat using methods her mother had taught her. Dieter could see her now, a small woman with severe features, working in the root cellar of their Pennsylvania farm. She kept barrels of coarse salt, purchased at significant expense each fall. When his father butchered a pig his grandmother, took the hams, and did something Dieter had thought strange at the time. She did not rub salt on the surface. She buried the hams completely. She filled the bottom of a barrel with 4 inches of salt, laid the ham in the center, then packed salt around every side until the meat disappeared completely under white crystals. She layered meat and salt until the barrel was full, ending with several inches of salt on top. The barrels sat in the cool cellar for months. When she retrieved a ham in spring, she would brush away the salt to reveal meat that looked and smelled as fresh as the day it was packed. Dieter had asked her once why she used so much salt when other families just rubbed it on the surface. She had looked at him with those severe eyes and said in her accented English, "Salt on the outside only delays. Salt on all sides prevents." At 8 years old, he had not understood the distinction. At 32, sitting beside a creek in Wyoming Territory with beaver blood on his hands, he understood perfectly. Surface salting slowed bacterial growth. Complete salt encasement stopped it entirely by removing the moisture bacteria needed to survive. The solution to his preservation problem was not a new technique. It was an old technique applied with sufficient commitment. He needed to bury meat in salt the way his grandmother had done. Completely, extravagantly, without compromise. Dieter arrived at Fort Benton in late August of 1837 with 8 beaver pelts, 4 wolf skins, and 2 prime elk hides from the spring season. The furs represented 4 months of work and would fetch approximately $200 at current market rates. For most trappers, that money meant whiskey, tobacco, a new rifle if the old one was failing, and enough basic supplies to last another season. For Dieter, it meant salt. The trading post sat on the Missouri River, a rough collection of log buildings where trappers from across the northern territories came to sell furs and buy supplies. Dieter waited in line behind 3 other mountain men, listening to them negotiate prices for powder and lead. When his turn came, he placed his furs on the counter and told the clerk what he wanted. 300 pounds of coarse rock salt, Dieter said. The clerk, a thin man with wire spectacles, looked up from examining the beaver pelts. "You mean 30 pounds. 300. The clerk set down the pelt he was holding. "That is more salt than I sell in 6 months to all the trappers combined. You understand what that costs? I have the money." Word spread quickly in the confined space of the trading post. By the time Dieter was negotiating details, a small crowd had gathered. Otto Schneider, a German trapper Dieter knew casually from previous seasons, pushed through to see what was happening. "Vogel is buying a fortune in salt," someone said behind him. Otto laughed, a harsh bark that carried across the room. "What are you planning, Dieter? Going to open a trading post? Or maybe you think you can sell salt to the Indians for more than beaver pelts?" Dieter ignored him and continued working with the clerk. In addition to the salt, he purchased 2 heavy iron hinges, each weighing 15 pounds, 50 square-cut nails, a draw knife for shaping wood, and a specialized plane for smoothing lumber. The total came to $187. Wilhelm Beck, another trapper Dieter had visited during his spring research, shook his head in disbelief. "You are spending a season's profit on salt and hardware? For what purpose?" "Preservation," Dieter said simply. "You can preserve meat with 10 pounds of salt if you are careful," Beck said. "This is madness." Otto was less diplomatic. "Vogel's fortune in white gold," he announced to the room. "The fool who trades beaver pelts for table seasoning. I give him 1 winter before he is back here, broke and begging for credit." Franz Zimmermann, an older trapper with 20 years in the mountains, examined the iron hinges Dieter had purchased. "These are for a door, a very heavy door." "What are you building?" "A box," Dieter said. The laughter that followed him out of the trading post was loud enough to hear from across the compound. Dieter loaded his purchases onto 2 mules he had purchased for transport. 300 pounds of salt plus hardware and tools meant a brutal 3-week journey back into the mountains. Every trapper in Fort Benton thought he was insane. Dieter did not care what they thought. He cared about building something that worked. Dieter returned to the Wyoming mountains in mid-September with his mules, his salt, and a clear vision of what needed to be built. He did not return to the cabin where Ernst had died. That location held too many failures. Instead, he selected a new site 3 miles west, on a slight rise with a northern exposure and clear sight lines in all directions. Most trappers would have built the cabin first. Dieter built the salt box first. If the preservation system failed, nothing else mattered. He spent the first week selecting trees. He needed tight-grained pine, straight and free of knots, for the lumber. He felled 6 trees, each approximately 14 inches in diameter, and spent days hewing them into planks using a felling axe and wedges. The work was exhausting and precise. Each plank needed to be 2 inches thick and as uniform as possible. He built a simple saw pit using one of the techniques he had observed at Fort Benton, where 2 men could mill lumber using a long pit saw. Working alone meant improvising. He rigged a system of ropes and a tripod to hold logs in position while he worked them with his draw knife and plane, shaving each plank smooth on all sides. The process took 3 full weeks. By mid-October, he had 8 planks ready, each 8 feet long, 2 inches thick, and 12 inches wide. The box dimensions were calculated based on his grandmother's barrels and his own estimates of a winter's meat supply. 3 feet long would accommodate large cuts laid flat. 20 inches wide allowed for adequate salt on all sides of the meat. 15 inches deep provided room for layering meat with proper salt coverage between layers. The interior volume would hold approximately 4 cubic feet of salt and meat combined. Construction began with the bottom. Dieter laid 2 planks side by side, joining them with a tongue and groove joint he carved carefully with his draw knife. The joint interlocked the plank so tightly that no light showed through the seam. He repeated the process for the sides and ends, cutting each piece to exact dimensions and fitting them together with obsessive precision. The corners were critical. Standard box construction used simple nailed joints that could separate under stress or moisture exposure. Dieter designed interlocking pins instead. He drilled holes through the corner joints using a brace and bit, then drove wooden pins he had carved from seasoned oak through multiple planks simultaneously. Each corner had 4 pins running in different directions, creating a rigid connection that could not be pulled apart. The interior was planed smooth to prevent any splinters or rough spots that might damage meat or create gaps where moisture could collect. He sealed the seams between planks with a mixture of pine resin and beeswax he had rendered himself, creating a waterproof barrier that remained slightly flexible. The lid was constructed from 3 planks joined with the same tongue and groove method. He mortised the heavy iron hinges into both the lid and the back wall of the box, recessing them so they sat flush. The hinges were through-bolted with the square-cut nails clinched over on the interior for permanent attachment. When finished, the lid weighed nearly 40 pounds, but moved smoothly on the hinges without binding. The first snow came on November 9, 1837, and Dieter killed his first elk 2 days later. A mature bull estimated at 600 pounds live weight, which would yield approximately 300 pounds of usable meat. He field-dressed the animal where it fell, loaded the quarters onto a travois he had built specifically for this purpose, and hauled everything back to his newly completed cabin over the course of 2 trips. The processing had to be meticulous. Dieter had learned from his research that blood accelerated decay even in preserved meat, so he spent hours carefully trimming every piece, removing all blood vessels, membranes, and any tissue that showed bruising or contamination. He cut the meat into portions sized for practical use, roasts of 4 to 6 pounds, steaks of 1 to 2 pounds. Each piece was washed in cold creek water until no trace of blood remained, then laid out on clean canvas to air dry for several hours. While the meat dried, Dieter prepared the salt box. He had positioned it against the north wall of his cabin, the coolest location, available as far from the fireplace as the small structure allowed. The box sat on a raised platform he had built to keep it off the dirt floor and improve air circulation underneath. He opened the lid and examined the interior one final time, checking for any rough spots or gaps he might have missed. The salt he had purchased was coarse rock salt, crystals, ranging from the size of wheat grains to small peas. It was not the fine table salt used for cooking, but mining salt, the same type his grandmother had used in Pennsylvania. Dieter poured the first layer into the bottom of the box, 4 inches deep, spreading it evenly with his hands and packing it firmly. The salt felt dry and slightly abrasive, with no clumping or moisture. He placed the first layer of meat on the salt bed. 3 large roasts, each weighing approximately 5 pounds, positioned with at least 2 inches of space between each piece and the walls of the box. The spacing was critical. Salt needed access to all surfaces for complete desiccation. He poured salt around each roast, working it carefully into every gap, ensuring no meat surface remained exposed. When the first layer was completely buried, he added another 4 inches of salt on top, creating a solid barrier. The second layer followed the same protocol. More roasts, more spacing, more salt, packed meticulously around every surface. Dieter worked slowly, checking his technique constantly against what he remembered from his grandmother's method. The salt transformed the bloody red meat into ghostly white shapes as it accumulated, each piece disappearing completely under the crystalline cover. By the time he finished, the box contained 48 pounds of elk meat and over 120 pounds of salt. The top layer was pure salt, 3 inches deep, creating a seal over everything below. Dieter closed the heavy lid and stepped back. The wooden box sat silent against the cabin wall, unremarkable except for what it represented. An entire season's profit transformed into a preservation experiment that would either validate his obsession or prove him a fool. December of 1837 brought the kind of winter that tested every trapper's preparation. The cold came early and settled deep, temperatures dropping so low that Dieter heard trees exploding in the darkness as sap froze and expanded. Then, without warning, warm Chinook winds would sweep down from the mountains, raising temperatures above freezing for days at a time before the cold returned with renewed brutality. Dieter knew these temperature swings were destroying frozen meat caches across the territory. Meat that thawed and refroze repeatedly developed the gray crystalline texture he had seen in Wilhelm Beck's stores the previous spring. The repeated freeze-thaw cycles ruptured cell walls, turning what should have been food into something closer to wet wood pulp. Every trapper dealing with conventional preservation was watching their winter. Supplies degrade with each weather change. The salt box sat undisturbed against the north wall. Dieter had established a protocol based on what little he remembered from his grandmother's technique. Minimum 3 weeks before the first inspection. Complete seal maintained to allow the salt time to draw moisture from the meat and create the desiccated environment that prevented bacterial growth. Opening the box prematurely would introduce humid air and potentially compromise the entire system. The waiting was harder than he had anticipated. Every day he walked past the box and fought the urge to check his investment. $187 sat in that wooden chest, transformed into salt and meat that might be rotting despite all his careful preparation. The doubt grew stronger as December progressed. What if he had missed something critical? What if the salt-to-meat ratio was wrong? What if his grandmother's technique only worked in Pennsylvania root cellars and failed in Wyoming mountain cabins? On December 23rd, Franz Zimmermann appeared at Dieter's door. The older trapper was checking on his neighbors before the worst of winter isolated everyone completely. He accepted coffee and sat by the fireplace, thawing frozen fingers while they talked about trap lines and game movements. Eventually, his eyes found the salt box. "That is what you spent your fortune building?" Franz walked over and examined the construction, running his hands over the smooth wood and heavy hinges. "Fine carpentry for a storage chest. Have you opened it yet?" "Not yet," Dieter said. "Why not?" "The salt needs time to work." Franz laughed, not unkindly. "You realize how mad this sounds? You spent more on salt than most men spend on a year's worth of supplies, built a fancy box to hold it, and now you will not even look inside to see if your meat is rotting." Dieter said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound defensive or foolish. Franz finished his coffee and stood to leave. "I hope it works, Dieter. Truly. But hope does not keep meat fresh. Salt, rub, and smoke, that is what works. What you have built is expensive hope in a wooden box." After Franz left, Dieter sat alone in the cabin, listening to wind howl through the pines, and wondered if the old trapper was right. On January 28, 1838, exactly 7 weeks after packing the first meat, Dieter opened the salt box. He had waited longer than his minimum 3-week protocol, partly from discipline and partly from fear. If the experiment had failed, opening the box would confirm that he had wasted an entire season's profit on an elaborate mistake. The cabin was cold that morning, temperature well below freezing, but not the brutal cold of deep winter. Dieter positioned his lantern near the box for maximum light and lifted the heavy lid. The hinges moved smoothly, and the interior was revealed under flickering lamplight. The top layer of salt looked different from when he had packed it. The pure white crystals had taken on a slightly gray tinge and had clumped together in places, no longer loose and free-flowing. This was expected. Salt was hygroscopic. It drew moisture from everything around it, including the air and, more importantly, the meat buried below. The clumping indicated the salt was doing exactly what Dieter needed it to do. He used a wooden scoop to carefully remove the top layer, setting the salt aside in a canvas bag for later reuse. The salt came away easily despite the clumping, and as he dug deeper, he began to see the white encrusted shapes of the meat beneath. His hands moved slowly, methodically, brushing salt away from the first roast like an archaeologist uncovering something fragile and ancient. The venison roast emerged from its salt tomb, with a coating of white crystals clinging to every surface. Dieter carried it to his work table and used a stiff brush to remove the salt, working carefully to expose the meat beneath. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. The meat was deep red, the color of fresh killed game. There was no gray discoloration, no brown oxidation on the surface, no smell of decay or off-gases that would indicate bacterial growth. The texture was firm when he pressed it with his thumb, not mushy or soft as partially rotted meat would be. It felt exactly like meat that had been butchered within the last day or two, not meat that had been stored for 7 weeks in a mountain cabin. Dieter cut a thin slice and examined it closely in the lamplight. The interior matched the exterior, consistent, deep red throughout, with no gradation or color change that would suggest the preservation had only worked on the surface. He smelled it carefully. There was a slight salt aroma, which was expected and actually desirable, but no hint of spoilage, no sour notes, nothing that suggested anything other than perfectly preserved meat. He built up his fire and cooked the slice in his iron skillet with nothing added, no seasonings that might mask problems. The meat cooked normally, releasing moisture and fat, developing the rich smell of cooking venison. When it was done, he ate it slowly, analyzing every aspect of the flavor and texture. It tasted like fresh meat. Not smoked meat with its heavy wood flavor, not frozen then thawed meat with its slightly metallic taste. Fresh meat, exactly as it would taste if he had killed the elk that morning. The warm spell hit in mid-February, 8 days of temperatures rising well above freezing during the afternoons. Snow melted from south-facing slopes, creating streams where none had existed. Icicles dripped continuously from cabin eaves. For trappers relying on frozen meat caches, it was a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Caspar Reinhardt appeared at Dieter's cabin on February 19th, looking thinner than he had in the fall. He was a quiet man, German, like Dieter, who trapped alone on a creek system about 12 miles south. They knew each other casually but had never been close. Casper's arrival without announcement meant something was wrong. "I need to buy meat from you," Casper said without preamble. "I can pay in furs or powder, whatever you need." Dieter invited him inside and offered coffee. Casper accepted but remained standing, too agitated to sit. His story came out in short, frustrated sentences. He had stored his winter meat using two methods, most of it frozen in a pit he had dug on a north-facing hillside, some of it smoked and hung in a shed near his cabin. Both systems had failed during the warm spell. The frozen meat had thawed partially, enough that when temperatures dropped again, it refroze into something barely recognizable as food. The exterior surfaces had oxidized to gray-brown, the texture had become grainy and unpleasant. And worst of all, some pieces had begun to smell slightly off even when frozen, indicating that bacteria had established itself during the thaw period. The smoked meat had fared even worse. The warm, humid conditions had created an environment where mold could grow despite the smoking. White and green patches had appeared on multiple pieces, spreading quickly in the shed's confined space. Casper had perhaps 3 weeks of marginally edible supplies remaining, with at least 8 weeks of winter left before reliable spring hunting. He faced genuine starvation unless he could acquire meat from someone whose preservation had held. "I heard the stories about your salt box," Casper said. "The others mock it, but I need to know. Did it work? Do you have meat that is actually good?" Dieter walked to the salt box without answering and opened the lid. He removed a venison roast, brushed away the clinging salt, and handed it to Casper. The other man examined it closely, clearly surprised by the deep red color and firm texture. "This is fresh," Casper said, confusion evident in his voice. "You cannot have killed recently. There are no tracks around your cabin, no blood, no hide scraps." "I packed it in November," Dieter said, 3 months ago." Casper looked from the meat to the salt box to Dieter's face, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what seemed possible. 3 months, and it looks like this?" Dieter cut a portion and cooked it while Casper watched. When it was done, he offered it to his visitor. Casper ate slowly, and Dieter saw the exact moment when understanding replaced skepticism. This was not merely preserved meat that remained technically edible. This was genuinely fresh meat, indistinguishable from a recent kill. "I need to know how you built this," Casper said quietly. Spring arrived in late March of 1838, and with it came visitors. Otto Schneider, who had mocked Dieter's fortune in white gold at Fort Benton, appeared first. He asked no questions about the salt box directly, but his eyes kept returning to it throughout the conversation. Before leaving, he inquired casually where Dieter had purchased his salt and what the cost had been per pound. Wilhelm Beck came next, bringing a beaver pelt as payment for information. He wanted exact dimensions of the box, specifications for the wood thickness, details about the salt-to-meat ratio. Dieter shared everything freely, drawing diagrams in the dirt outside his cabin, explaining the importance of a complete burial rather than surface application. Beck took notes in a small journal, asking questions about corner construction and hinge placement that revealed he was planning to build his own version. By May, Franz Zimmermann had constructed a salt box using Dieter's design. By the following autumn, 6 trappers in the surrounding territory had built their own versions. The technique spread quietly through the mountain community, passed along through practical demonstration rather than promotion. Dieter never claimed credit or asked for compensation. He had solved a problem that had killed his partner, and if others could benefit from that solution, it seemed appropriate to share it. The method acquired names as it spread. Some called it Vogel's method, after Dieter's surname. Others simply called it the salt box, or salt packing. The specific implementation varied based on available materials and individual skill, but the core principles remained consistent: complete salt burial, proper box construction, adequate salt quantity, and patience to let the preservation process work without premature inspection. By 1843, The technique was established enough that trappers new to the territory learned about it from veterans. The initial mockery had transformed into quiet acceptance. Men who had lost meat to spoilage, freezer burn, or inadequate smoking recognized that Dieter's expensive, time-consuming method actually worked better than conventional approaches. The upfront investment in salt and construction effort paid dividends in reliable winter food supplies. Dieter left the mountains in 1844. The fur trade was collapsing as silk replaced beaver felt in hat manufacturing, and the era of the mountain man was ending. He took his savings and moved to the Oregon Territory, purchasing a small ranch in the Willamette Valley. He married in 1846, started a family, and lived quietly, raising cattle and growing wheat. His wife knew he had been a trapper, but he rarely spoke about those years. He died in 1867 at the age of 62, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew nothing of salt boxes or winter preservation. His gravestone outside Salem listed him simply as a rancher and farmer. There was no mention of his time in the Wyoming mountains or the technique he had developed. But in the mountains, the legacy persisted. Abandoned cabins contained salt boxes built using Dieter's joinery methods. Frontier survival guides documented salt packing as a proven preservation technique. New settlers moving west discovered the method and adopted it for their own homesteads. The impossible had become routine, meat staying genuinely fresh for entire winters through nothing more than salt, wood, and careful engineering.